But I do think this nonsense of two quarterbacks, as I said, I think the Eagles realize that's not something you want to do going down the road.
You're listening to the JAKIB Media Sports Network in partnership with AM 1490 Sports Betting Radio. Subscribe to the JAKIB Media channel on YouTube for access to all daily sports content.
All right, welcome back to The Fix on a Wednesday, live in the Prop Swap Studios. Sixers win. Tobias Harris creating a shot off the dribble for a game winner. Beautiful. Sixers with a big win at home, measuring stick game, as they say. But, all right, let's transition now to some Eagles talk, and it's time for your nightly football fix with our NFL Eagles insider, Johnny Mack. Follow John McMullen on Twitter, at JFMcMullen, PhillyVoice.com, SI.com, and host of Extending the Play every Saturday morning right here on 1490, 10 a.m. to 11 a.m. John, how are we doing tonight?
Doing well. Yeah, Tobias Harris. Killing some narratives there. Big play. Good for him.
Yeah, I'm happy for him, man. That's a good sign. That's a good sign. I've been critical of him in the past about his inability to do just that, and he did it. So, hey, good sign. But, all right, let's get to some Eagles talk here. And there's some more news, John, surrounding the team, and I'll let you take it from there.
Well, two more coaches, and I think a big one today for people that were focused on, for obvious reasons, the quarterback position. And to be able to get Brian Johnson out of Florida and, offensive coordinator there. Interesting, only 33 years old. So we've talked about the lack of experience on this coaching staff as a whole. That theme continues, and a lot of people criticize Press Taylor was 33, and maybe he didn't have enough gravitas and experience, too much of a peer with Carson Wentz. Well, you got another 33-year-old guy, so I don't know how that fixes that part of it, but we'll see. And he has a relationship with Jalen Hurts that dates back a long time. Played for his dad in high school, recruited Jalen. So a lot of people are trying to put those two things together and try to get the Eagles to read the tea leaves and think the Eagles are maybe now leaning towards Jalen Hurts, but nobody's hiring coaches for one player. I mean, people need to get that out of their heads. They really do.
We'll get to that in a second, but Johnson has been with the Florida Gators since 2018, started off as a QB coach and then became offensive coordinator in the 2020 season. Before then, 1 year in Houston as their OC QB's coach and 3 years with Mississippi State before that. And that's where, that's the time frame where a lot of people point to because he supposedly helped Dak Prescott become an NFL draft pick. Was that a factor?
It's all a factor. I'm not going to say it's not a factor. Obviously, this is his first professional job. So you look at some of the things he's done in the past, some of the quarterbacks he's mentored in the past, and Dak would obviously be the most notable. Even recently, Kyle Trask is going to be drafted this year. So he's worked with some good quarterbacks. He played quarterback at Utah and was actually Alex Smith's backup. So that tells you how, young he is. So, I mean, you're going to put that on the top of your resume because what Dak has turned into. And we'll see, a lot of people have made that comparison. They made that comparison before, and that's another thing that I think people kind of sort of speculate and say a lot of people compare Jalen Hurts to Dak Prescott from a skill set standpoint, from how they play, even leadership aspects off the field, and are kind of overreaching on that part of it as well. I will say he's a fast rising coach. He's, he was on the fast. He's already gotten head coaching interviews at the college level. So you see what his, ambition is, and that's obviously to be a head coach in the NFL. And you can get there pretty quickly if you, coach the quarterback position, have some success. That's a step away from an offensive coordinator, and then bang, all of a sudden you're a head coach. And we know how this league is trending with young head coaches. And so, this is a big opportunity for him.
All right, so it's coming together now. Quarterback coach hired. We have the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. So looking at this staff, how are we assessing it, and what's going to be different this year with this completely new regime?
Well, if we all knew that, we'd have it all figured out. I think, David Culley got hired tonight by Houston, so all 7 positions are filled, all first-time head coaches. Dan Campbell was an interim coach in Miami, but this is his first full-time job in Detroit. Everybody else is a pure rookie head coach, even a guy like David, who is in his 60s versus, some of these young guys. And by the way, he's another Andy Reid guy. He was here basically Andy's entire tenure. He was here with the Eagles. But it's, nobody knows. And I think the best indication of that is 2016 when, the Eagles got laughed at and everyone said they had the worst hire of the cycle, and they turned out to have the best hire of the cycle. Now, you probably don't want to, want people to think you got the worst guy ever. And it is probably rare that the guy people think will be the worst turns out to be the best, but nobody knows. I mean, and essentially, maybe you know a little bit about guys who have been head coaches before if they're getting second opportunities, but every single one of these guys, besides, as I mentioned, Campbell on an interim basis, has never done it before. So everybody's flying blind. And I've said before on the show, my biggest concern is the lack of a veteran presence in a major part of the staff. So, I would have liked to have had a more veteran offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator, and maybe even a former head coach, and not even from a football standpoint, because I talk about this all the time. People do not understand the enormity of this job. Fans don't understand that there's so much outside of football that you have to deal with. And obviously when you're doing it for the first time, you're sort of learning on the fly, learning as you go. And it's nice to have a sounding board. And that's why in the past, when people have hired young coaches, they've generally had that sounding board. I don't see that here. And it's pretty evident because the major spots are filled. It's probably not going to be here.
What's the thought process behind that? Just pure speculation, of course, from us. But if you know it, if I know it, if that's always been the case for the most part, Howie and Jeffrey Lurie have to know it. So what made them decide, you know what, let's just go young all around? What's the pros and cons for this situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Jeffrey did call it a transition period. Maybe he understands there's going to be some growing pains, and maybe he doesn't have a problem with it. That would be a shift in his philosophy. But maybe, it's pretty evident that he does understand there were some issues with how they went about getting assistant coaches. And they seem to have shifted directions and given the head coach more responsibility in that regard. So that's a positive. Whether the head coach makes the right decisions, we'll have to see. And that, experience is part of it. but these are guys he trusts. And I talked about trust a lot with Doug Peterson. That was one of the problems with the assistant coaches. They kept getting rid of guys he trusted. So, maybe it took this divorce for the Eagles to understand it's probably better if the head coach has people he trusts around him than people, and not even necessarily that he doesn't trust or that he looks sideways at, just that he doesn't know and doesn't have that relationship with. So maybe they've learned from that, and that's a good thing.
You mentioned, no hire is for one individual, whether that's Jalen Hurts, whether that's Carson Wentz. It doesn't matter. That's not how this process works. So I ask you, why these guys, and how are they going to be expected to manage this quarterback situation? How do they mend this relationship that Carson Wentz has with the team, which isn't a great one at the moment?
Well, in theory, I mean, you hope he doesn't have a relationship with these guys, and you hope you sort of reset everything and hit Control-Alt-Delete, and he comes in with an open mind, and we'll see how it works out. And if he has issues with Jeffrey Lurie, which I would find, very difficult to believe, to be honest, because Jeffrey's always been in Carson's corner. So I don't know if that would be insurmountable. A lot of it is I just think he's got such a bad taste in his mouth for how things went last year. He probably would like a new start somewhere else. Just from a cleansing standpoint, just to get out of the toxic way he thinks he was treated. But once you eliminate the people he was angry at, there's no reason to be angry at Nick Sirianni. I mean, there's no reason to be angry about guys you don't know and guys you haven't met. So we'll see how all of that shakes out. But, anytime my point with you don't hire coaches for one player, you expect, your hope is that, Nick Sirianni's going to be around for a while. Now, if the best case scenario happens and you win a Super Bowl, you do understand you're going to lose high profile assistants. That happens all the time. So maybe you don't have the same, hope that a guy's going to be around for a decade like the head coach, but you do expect your coaching staff to be around for a while. And, in those scenarios, they're going to outlast players if everything works out well. So anybody who says, oh, they're bringing in Johnson to because he's got a relationship with Jalen Hurts, I mean, come on. Why? I mean, because he recruited him? Oh, first of all, he didn't even get him. Second of all, Jalen Hurts was recruited by a lot of people. He was a 4-star recruit at Alabama for, what? I mean, guess what? There's a lot of teams recruiting him. That's how college football works. So, and it's been years and years and years since then. And he's been with different quarterbacks and vice versa. Jalen Hurts has been with different coaches. He's going to come in, and if they're both here, he's going to have to make assessments on the players themselves, not because he recruited Jalen Hurts when he was going to Alabama. I mean, it's silly to me.
What's going to change strictly from a scheme standpoint? So how will the offense look? How much different will it look, if at all? And let's just assume Carson Wentz is the starter. What do you think Jalen's role is going to be? The same, more, or less?
Less. I do think this, I talked about learning a lesson with the coaching staff, I think this organization as a whole also learned a lesson about this nonsense about two quarterbacks. You don't want two quarterbacks. You want to pick a starter and have a backup, and that's it. And I think ultimately that's what the Eagles do. And I think that's what they should do. As far as the offense changing, I will say, I mean, everybody's a little bit different. You sort of have versions, but if you're going to be honest with yourself, I mean, Frank Reich ran basically the same offense. I was told down to the terminology that the Eagles ran. A little bit different. They didn't use as much 12, obviously, because even though they have really good tight ends, they don't have, Zach Ertz, Dallas Goedert. So, and they had better receivers. So I always told you if the Eagles had better receivers, they'd play more 11. They just have terrible receivers. So there's going to be little tweaks like that depending on personnel. But the offense that Nick learned from Frank and is Doug's offense, who he learned from Andy. And there's going to be certain tweaks, as I mentioned. I think they certainly want to do some different things. They'll have new eyes. They'll look at players differently, maybe. People have always talked about Miles Sanders and using him as a receiver. Well, they'll probably think about that more, but they haven't seen Miles. And I said a lot of this comes down to players, Ryan. People talk about fixing Carson Wentz. He's going to fix himself. They talk about Miles Sanders being a receiver. Well, guess what? Learn how to run some routes. Learn how to be in the right positions, and you'll get used more as a receiver. It's more those types of things. But I will say also, if you want to criticize the old coaching staff, I think where you would start is player development. Because I think, people look at the draft and they want to say, insert name, Justin Jefferson's better than Jalen Reagor. And it's always going to be that way. Well, maybe it is always going to be that way. But I think the assumption is, well, the Eagles are dumb. And if you switch Justin Jefferson and put him here, and you put Reagor in Minnesota, you're going to have similar results. Player development is a real thing. Coaching is a real thing. It doesn't stop when you get drafted. It just starts. And guys get better or they get worse dependent on where they are, the schemes they're in, the coaching they get. And that's the far more important stuff than scheme. People get so caught up in scheme. Every single coach I've ever met, and I'll tell you this, every single coach, it's about execution. If you're hiring a scheme, you're doing it wrong.
Talking with John McMullen. Follow John on Twitter at JFMcMullen. I asked you about Jalen's role, Jalen Hurts, assuming Carson Wentz is the starter. Well, I want to ask a little two-part question here then. Is he being considered at all as the starting quarterback? And the second part of this question is, how should they handle Jalen Hurts? Everyone's talking about the right guys to fix Carson Wentz, to manage and coach Carson Wentz. And, it's like one child is struggling and you focus so much on him, you forget about the other sibling there. So, how should this coaching staff manage Jalen Hurts as well as Carson Wentz?
Well, I think the conventional thought is you don't have as much to worry about because of where Jalen is in his career. As he'll be a second-year player, as a second-round pick. He wasn't the second pick in the draft, so he kind of understood where he came into this league, and you have to work yourself into a starting spot. And then you have just the personality differences. And Jalen tends to be a quiet guy, a hard worker naturally, a guy who's going to accept coaching. We've heard that word stubborn with Carson time and time again. You talk about kids. If you want to compare it to children, maybe have the rambunctious one and the one that's just kind of quiet and goes about his business. And I think the latter is Jalen Hurts. So I don't think they have that concern, number one. As for how they handle this, I mean, look, they just got their quarterback coach today. I mean, this is literally brand new.
Yeah.
Brand new head coach, brand new offensive coordinator, brand new passing game coordinator, who've never worked with these quarterbacks unless you want to go back to when Jalen Hurts was 4 years old or whatever. But you get my point. I mean, they don't have a plan yet. I do find it interesting that before they hired Nick, they had not contacted Jalen Hurts. So it kind of told, A, they have their mind on different things. B, this is not the time of year. You can't have meetings with players. I mean, that's collectively bargained. But, you tend to stay in touch with phone calls with the quarterback and things like that. But they had a lot on their plates. So this is all going to be a work in progress. But I do think ultimately it's going to be really difficult for the Eagles to trade Carson Wentz. We talked about this a lot. So I think their first default position is, let's see if we can fix things with Carson Wentz. And if that doesn't work, we have a safety net in Jalen Hurts. Ultimately, I think that's the way they're going to look at it. But we'll see. I mean, things change quickly in this league. The problem for the Eagles is they change quickly at the quarterback position. Now, it's still pie in the sky to think Deshaun Watson is going anywhere or Aaron Rodgers is going anywhere. But if those two try to force their way out and they're really, really difficult about it, all of a sudden they become the gems of the offseason. And even if they don't, as I said, you still got Matthew Stafford now, who's way more valuable than Carson Wentz. And then you don't even talk about the guys in the draft. And certainly at the top of the draft, we all know Jacksonville. And then you have Zach Wilson, who's going to go probably, if he doesn't go 2, somebody's going to trade up and get him at 3. So, Carson Wentz is not as desirable as probably Eagles fans think he is.
When I ask you about how the Eagles should handle Jalen Hurts, I agree with everything you said. There's not much to agree on. I think it's just fact. He's a second-round pick. He has a great mentality and mindset already. He's a hard worker. He's coachable. But even just from the Eagles' standpoint, it's a little bit of a muddy situation. Breaking news there. But you did play this guy for 4 games, and he showed some serious promise, at least in my mind. So it's like, all right, if we just go back to the thought process of he's a second-round pick, we'll get to you when we get to you, you could be missing out on an opportunity to develop him. Not saying you should focus on that, but it's just like a tricky situation. That's what I'm trying to get to.
I agree. They should have never drafted him. We've talked about
right.
that. It's just and you can kind of look at it 2 ways now. I mean, you could argue that Carson Wentz doesn't have the historic fall from grace if that's not on his mind and he thinks the organization is not being disloyal to him, whatever, however you want to spin it. Or you can say, wow, it's nice to have a safety net because this guy fell in the crapper, so to speak. So I guess you can look at it either way. But I do think this nonsense of 2 quarterbacks, as I said, I think the Eagles realize that's not something you want to do going down the road. But in a lot of ways, those last 4 games, I think they're kind of a race now because you did change the coaching staff. And these guys, they'll look at the film, obviously. They'll evaluate the tape, but they didn't have Jalen Hurts. So they're starting from scratch, and they're going to see things the way they see things. And Look, I mean, it was reported in a lot of places that, Jeffrey asked every single candidate, what would you do to sort of save or fix or get Carson Wentz going back in the right direction? So that tells you something. If he's asking the question, it's probably not because he's thinking that Carson Wentz isn't going to be here.
John, Eric Bieniemy, on the outside looking in, once again, how surprised are you at that, if at all?
Unfortunately, I'm not surprised. I do think, Roger Goodell is secretly clicking his heels that Houston did hire a minority candidate in David Culley. So at least there's one black hire in the cycle, and we're back up to 3 African-American coaches in, 32 teams. What is that, 8-9% of a league that is 69% African-American. So still not good, but a lot better. If they hired, say, Josh McCown, the league would be taking pretty significant hits. So I do think they're happy that David Culley got the job. Look, there's some things with Eric Bieniemy, some fair, some not. There were some issues early in his career in way back in Colorado. I don't, people bring that up, and I don't know. Would that be brought up for a non-African American coach after this kind of time? I remember, excuse me, Ryan, I remember covering him in Minnesota as a running backs coach, and people brought that up, and he was just a position coach. And then you have he doesn't interview well trope. I don't know. I will say, and I've said this about Jeffrey Lurie, and he finally got some diversity in his coaching staff today. A lot of these guys don't seriously consider minority candidates, and they can make all the excuses they want. They just don't. And I understand why people are upset by it. They think they're hiring the best candidate. I fully believe Jeffrey Lurie believes that. But his record is what his record is. And, you look at somebody like David Culley, who was here for, 99 to 2012. I believe he was here the entire time. As Andy's receivers coach. And late in his career, he was also given the title of senior offensive assistant or something of that nature. He's been the assistant head coach. He went with Andy to Kansas City. He's been the assistant head coach with John Harbaugh in Baltimore. So he wasn't a high-profile guy for whatever reason. But, boy, the league kind of lucked out that Houston went in that direction, to be honest.
John McMullen joins me every night at 10:30, at least for the next 2 nights, then 7:30 starting next Monday. John, we're about to enter our end-of-the-hour break, so thank you, my friend, and we'll do it again tomorrow.
All right, thank you, Ron.
Yep, thank you. Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen. Good stuff there. I'll react to that discussion when we come back. Jeff Parles at 11:15. Keep it locked in.